Good morning, Year 12. It's Miss K here. I hope that all of you are keeping well and safe, especially during this season of pandemic. I do hope that we will get through this and we will get past all this remote learning. For today's lesson, I'm going to do a voiceover. I'm just talking through the PowerPoints on plasticity and functional recovery of the brain as we are still in the biopsychology topic. Last week I had tonsillitis, so I wasn't able to do this, but I'm hoping that we can keep this up for as long as we need to. I think it is also helpful to have someone talking through the PowerPoints. There will be stages where videos will pop up for you to watch. So what I would suggest is that you just type in the name of the video on YouTube and have a watch where it would normally come up in the PowerPoint if we were in a lesson. I hope all of this makes sense. And of course, if you have any questions, make sure that you do email me. I'd be happy to respond via email. When I think about the word plasticity, I think of other words such as flexibility, adaptable, changeable, malleable. And all of these words suggest that if we are saying that our brain is indeed plastic, we're saying that our brain is flexible, our brain will adapt, our brain will change in response to certain experiences and also inexperiences. So throughout the rest of this lesson, our aim is to understand what we mean by brain plasticity and also to be able to apply our knowledge to research that has been done. And as always in psychology, we want to evaluate, we want to look at research with a critical eye and celebrate, the wins of the research, but also throw shade and say actually they missed out on key areas such as perhaps population validity or temporal validity, is our favorite one. So at this point, I would like you to pause the video and type in "your brain is plastic" on YouTube and have a watch of this 4-minute clip. So brain plasticity refers to the brain's ability to change and adapt because of experience. Research has demonstrated that the brain continues to create new neural pathways and alter existing ones in response to changing experiences. And all behaviors change our brains, even behaviors that we do not perform changes our brain. A good example that I have is that my mum's a midwife, and my mum, she was phenomenal at maths when she was in school. But she now says that because she wasn't using her maths brain so much as a midwife, perhaps if you were to give her a very difficult sum to complete now, it may take her a longer period of time to complete that sum. But if you gave her a task to do as a midwife, of course, she'll be able to do it rapidly, with speed and with excellence, because her brain is readily engaged in such activities as part of her line of work. And that is a good example of brain plasticity. And I urge you to think about some examples where perhaps you may be able to identify that your brain has changed due to your lack of experience in a particular area. It might be that you learn a language in year 11 or throughout secondary school. Maybe you were learning French or Spanish, and now if you came across a French or Spanish word, it will be much more difficult to, I guess, understand and interpret it. That will be an example of brain plasticity. And here's another point where I want you to pause and also watch this TED Talk on brain plasticity. It's a brilliant TED Talk. It's very comprehensive, and it really does touch on many areas of psychology surrounding brain plasticity. Also, this question of which issue and debate could you link brain plasticity to and why? Think about nature versus nurture, think about biological reductionism, think also about biological determinism as well. And then thinking about how brain plasticity research may link to the economy. Well, of course, if you've got people with high performing, high functioning brains, then of course they will have greater use towards the economy. But for example, if you have people who have suffered from brain damage and so on, again, the fact that our brain is plastic and our brain is able to heal and adapt to certain experiences, that may benefit the economy as well, because it may mean that you have less people in hospital with permanent brain damage. So have a look at this TED Talk and use the next slide to almost gather your thoughts on it. So after watching that TED Talk, some of the key points that I took when I watched the TED Talk were that indeed our brain changes in 3 ways. we engage in chemical changes. And right now, as you are learning, your brain is engaging in a chemical change because you are using your short-term memory right now as you are watching this video. There are structural changes as well that occur, and this is in direct relation to our long-term memory. So for example, the words that I'm using right now, you would have to dig deep into your long-term memory to find understanding and attach meaning to what I am saying, and that indicates a structural change. And then finally, there's functional changes, and this is where, for example, if someone has brain damage in one area of the brain is so cool that another area of the brain will take over the function of the damaged area. And I find this to be so phenomenal, and I think as we go through the PowerPoint, we'll see examples of research whereby there has been an individual who's experienced brain damage in one area of the brain and another side of the brain has taken over that function. What I like here also is that difficulty during practice will lead to more changes in the brain. So sometimes we avoid difficult tasks because we feel like it's too much pressure, but actually difficult tasks are really good for strengthening and creating new neural connections. So I guess this is my little plug-in that if you struggle with anything in psychology or in any other subject, it's actually a good thing, and it's indicating that your brain is forcing itself to create new neural connections. And lastly, everyone is their own designer for their brain, so you decide how your brain will be shaped, and I find that to be really, really cool. So during infancy, the brain experiences rapid growth in the number of synaptic connections it has, peaking at approximately 15,000 by the age of 2 to 3 years old. This equates to twice as many as there are in the adult brain. As we age, rarely used connections are deleted, and frequently used connections are strengthened in a process known as cognitive pruning. This shows that the brain is in a continual state of change from growth in early years to change and refinement in adulthood as we learn and experience. So that key word cognitive pruning, which I've underlined there, is super key in explaining why it is that certain tasks that we try to perform as growing adults may be seemingly difficult than perhaps when we were infants, and that's to do with cognitive pruning. That is to say, with the example that I gave about my mum, who's a midwife, indeed her brain has gone through cognitive pruning because she hasn't used that mathematical side of her brain. And even for me, in terms of learning French at school, I haven't used that side of my brain. So my brain has cognitively pruned the area for learning a new language, and it doesn't consider it useful anymore. Therefore, the connections have been deleted. A key study was done on brain plasticity by Maguire et al. In the year 2000, and they looked at London taxi drivers. And what they did is they gave these taxi drivers magnetic resonance imaging to scan their brain, and they compared their brains to a matched control group. And when we say they're a matched control group, of course the control group would not be taxi drivers, but they would be matched on certain qualities such as age, gender, and perhaps any other skills that may perhaps affect the area of the brain that they were interested in. What they did find is that taxi drivers had a larger posterior hippocampus when compared to the matched control group, and that area of the brain is responsible for spatial and navigational skills. So it makes sense that indeed taxi drivers, London taxi drivers, their brains had adapted, had changed, had shown plasticity in response to the demands of their job. And it's interesting to know that London taxi drivers have to take a very comprehensive test to check their knowledge of all the streets in London, and they have to be able to do it off the top of their head. So it does indicate that there is support for brain plasticity when we're looking at London taxi drivers and this research by Maguire et al. But also we know that whenever we look at research in psychology, we always evaluate. So just having a look at this piece of research, Maguire et al., year 2000, what is our number one evaluation point with regards to validity? And also the fact that they compared the taxi drivers to a matched control group, that suggests that indeed the study would be high in internal validity. And that's because they were trying to establish cause and effect without any confounding variables that could interfere with what they were hoping to measure, which is the structure of the brain in these two groups. To further address some of the evaluation points that come up through Maguire et al.'s research, I'm going to have sentence starters for point evidence, explanation, paragraphs, and you guys can have a go at home completing these paragraphs in your own time. Also use the textbook as well to elaborate on these evaluation points. So I've already spoken about the use of control groups and how it allows us to establish cause and effect. It also allows us to establish comparative validity and internal validity. Also, the use of scientific objective measurements such as the magnetic resonance imaging. This allows for objectivity and it removes all bias. Also, it increases the internal validity and allows us to regard psychology as a science. The study has real-world application, so the fact that they use taxi drivers is an absolute positive. It does mean that the study can be readily applied to other taxi drivers in London. However, we might say that actually there is an issue of establishing cause and effect, because it could be that these taxi drivers, before they became taxi drivers, they already had an enlarged posterior hippocampus, and that's why they became taxi drivers. We can't say that it is the taxi driving that caused the increased grey matter in the posterior hippocampus. So we have to take the research with a pinch of salt and still use our critical eye when we are evaluating it. And of course, I've already mentioned the year 2000, we are in 2020 now, so we might argue that actually taxi drivers nowadays, they are using sat-navs, and therefore this study would be low in temporal validity in terms of its relevance for the present day. Now, if you are into video games, you may want to pause here and search for this particular video on YouTube, How Video Games Change Your Brain. It's an interesting watch, and I think even we can apply this particular video to even the way our use of mobile phones changes our brain. So pause the video here and go and look for this on YouTube. Okay, so this particular slide is going to go through 3 pieces of research which provide support for brain plasticity. But we know it's always good to be extra, and as we go through each of these pieces of research, we will offer some critical evaluation of the study. The first one is research that investigated brain plasticity in students. Dragansky et al. In 2006 scanned the brains of a group of German medical students 3 months before and right after an important exam. They then compared the scans to scans of students who were not studying for an exam. The students who were studying for an exam showed learning-induced changes in the parietal cortex and posterior hippocampus, regions known to be involved in memory retrieval and learning. So this study suggests that the process of intentionally studying for an exam actually changes one's brain. But of course, this study was done on a group of German medical students, and therefore we might argue that it is low in population validity because we can't readily apply this study to non-German medical students without caution. Also, the study was done in 2006, and there might be an argument that it's low in temporal validity. This is because medical exams may have changed since then, and therefore the findings of this research may be limited in its applicability to the present day. Another study was done on plasticity in musicians. And in this study, it was a study of professional, amateur, and non-musicians, which found that the grey matter volume was highest in professional musicians, and intermediate in amateurs, and lowest in non-musicians. So it suggests that actually, if you are an expert musician, your brain has changed and adapted for the purpose of being a musician. And then we've got plasticity in bilinguals. So it seems that brain plasticity is a factor in learning a second language. Bilingual brains have a larger left inferior parietal cortex than monolingual brains. This part of the brain is known to be concerned with language, mathematics, and body image. So remember from the last set of PowerPoints that I gave you to go through, you looked at lateralization of the brain, and we know that the left hemisphere of the brain is responsible for speech and language. So it makes sense that indeed bilinguals may have larger amount of grey matter in their left hemisphere. So at this stage, I would like you to open up to page 160 in your textbooks and summarize the section on how playing video games and meditation offers research support for brain plasticity. I would also like you to have a read of the study by Kemperman et al. and answer the following questions as you are summarizing it. So, who did they study? How did they study them? What did they find? And what were their conclusions? And also offer some evaluation for this study by Kemperman et al. Okay, so many of us may know someone who has experienced a stroke. And one of the key questions of medical professionals and even people like us, we may ask ourselves, what actually happens to the brain when someone has a stroke? And is their brain ever able to recover? And for this section of the lesson, we'll be focusing on the brain's ability to recover its function, even when it's undergone a degree of trauma, such as through stroke or through head injury. At this point, you can quickly go onto YouTube or you can go onto Google and just type in what happens to your brain when you have a stroke and have a read or have a listen to what the information has to offer. So one of my favorite areas of brain plasticity is understanding how the brain is able to recover after trauma. And as someone who has experienced trauma myself, it is so reassuring to know that my brain has got that covered. And when we talk about functional recovery, we are talking about the brain's ability to transfer functions from a damaged area of the brain to undamaged areas. All that means is if we say, for example, your Broca's area, which is responsible for speech production, let's say that gets damaged, God forbid. But let's say it gets damaged. What happens is that an underused area of the brain will take over that function and give you the ability to speak again. Whether your speech is going to be back to 100%, it's not always the case, but at least you get a degree of that function back due to a process called neuronal unmasking. So neuronal unmasking is where dormant synapses, which have not received enough input to be active, open connections to compensate for a nearby damaged area of the brain. This allows new connections in the brain to be activated, thus recovering any damage occurring in specific regions. I think that is super, super cool. So an example of neuronal unmasking is you can see on this side, this is the area of the brain that has been damaged. And this area of the brain is responsible for our motor skills, our motor abilities. And what happens is neuronal unmasking takes an area of the brain that it is underused, it's not used for any particular purpose, but it takes over the function of that motor skill, that motor task, and it begins to function as normal. It begins to allow the individual to function as normal. So this is where a nearby undamaged area of the brain takes over the function of the damaged area, and this is neuronal unmasking. So to delve in a little bit deeper into neural unmasking or neuronal unmasking, we understand that indeed during recovery, other areas of the brain which are unused but they are not damaged, they will take over the function of damaged areas of the brain. And there are a number of changes that occur through this process. There's a process of axon sprouting, and this is where your nerve endings grow and connect with undamaged areas. There's reformation of blood vessels and regeneration. So we know that there's certain foods that we can take to replenish our cells and to increase multiplication of cells. These are all important when it comes to functional recovery of the brain. And then also we've got recruitment of homologous, which also means similar areas on the opposite hemisphere to perform specific tasks. So for example, if Broca's area, which is located in the left hemisphere and it's responsible for speech production, if that becomes damaged, it is likely that an area in the right hemisphere will take over that function. And I think again, we can celebrate the fact that our brain is so cool in the sense that it can do these things, that one hemisphere will take over the function of the other hemisphere if that hemisphere becomes damaged. How cool is that? Functional recovery of the brain can also take place via the use of stem cells. And you would have come across stem cells during your study of GCSE science. Stem cells are unspecialized cells which have the potential to give rise to different cell types that carry out different functions, including nerve cells. And stem cells can be used in three ways to bring healing or to restore, recover the brain after trauma. One way is that stem cells can be implanted to replace dead or dying cells. They can be transplanted to heal damaged cells. And also they can be transplanted to an undamaged area of the brain to create a neural network that connects to the damaged region through the process of axon sprouting, which we looked at in previous slides. So there's been research into functional recovery through the use of stem cells, and this research was done on rats. So Tajiri et al. In the year 2013 provided evidence for the role of stem cells in recovery from brain injury. They randomly assigned rats with induced traumatic brain injury to one of two groups. One group received transplants of stem cells into the region of the brain affected by traumatic injury. The control group received a solution infused into the brain containing no stem cells. 3 months after the brain injury, the brains of the stem cell rats showed clear development of neuron-like cells in the area of injury. This was accompanied by a solid stream of stem cells migrating to the brain sites of injury. This was not the case with the control group. So this research, albeit it was done on rats, it provides support for the fact that stem cells indeed can promote functional recovery of the brain after it's experienced trauma. But we know that animal studies, they are hard to generalize to humans. However, animal studies allow us to do things that perhaps we would not be able to do on humans due to ethical issues. Though arguably we might say that it is still unethical to induce traumatic brain injury to rats just for the purpose of research. So here's some further evaluation, research-based evaluation on functional recovery of the brain after trauma. And one such research focuses on human echolocation, which is a learned ability for humans to sense their environment from echoes. This ability is used by some blind people to navigate their environment and sense their surroundings in detail. Now, if we think about it, blind people, they have damage to their occipital lobe, which is responsible for visual processing. Studies in 2010 and 2011 using functional magnetic resonance imaging techniques have shown that parts of the brain associated with visual processing are adapted for the new skill of echolocation. Studies with blind patients, for example, suggest that click echoes heard by these patients were processed by brain regions devoted to vision rather than audition. In humans, evidence is restricted to small-scale studies of people who already have issues, so it is unclear whether what we are seeing is due to recovery or in individual differences. So just to further explain this piece of research, it is suggested that whilst blind people have damage to their occipital lobe, it suggests that the use of echoes, which is an auditory processing, the use of echoes to navigate and to explore their environment, which would ultimately require their occipital lobe if they were not blind, has actually been taken over. So it suggests functional recovery in that respect. Now, what I would like you to do for the remaining slides of this particular lesson is have a look at page 161 in your Year 1 textbooks and read the evaluation points with regards to age differences in functional recovery and also educational attainment in functional recovery. Read these and try to explain them to someone at home. And remember that when you try to explain something that you have just read, it's a fantastic way of memorizing what you've covered, but also allowing yourself to check your understanding of what you've learned as well. So I want you to pause the PowerPoint here and give yourself a moment to do that task. And just to finish off, I want you to have a go at this 4-mark application-based question. It says, Josie is 12. Last year, she was involved in a serious road accident and suffered head injuries that caused problems with speech and understanding language. Now, a year later, Josie has recovered most of her language abilities. Using your knowledge of plasticity and functional recovery of the brain after trauma, explain Josie's recovery. So I want you to have a go at writing your own answer to this question. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to upload a model answer that I wrote with my class last year, so you can compare what you've written with my model answer. It will be uploaded on a PDF. And make sure you make any adjustments, any notes, any corrections as well. It's worth noting that my answer is very comprehensive, is very detailed, but again, detail is great, being extra is great, being extra will get you the marks. I do hope that this lesson was helpful. If you have any questions, make sure you let me know. God bless you guys, stay safe, and hopefully I'll be able to record another one.